here we are at Fort Stevens. This is an Oregon State Park. The fort was used by multiple military organizations between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of World War II, and it holds the distinction of being the only military institution fired upon by enemies during World War II.
Fort Stevens had a very humorous beginning. The fort is one of 3 forts built on the Columbia River for the Civil War and is the only fort of the 3 on the Oregon side. Ironically, the fort is named after a former Washington governor. Humorously, the fort was not finished until after the Civil War. It spent a few years after, housing troops, but was eventually closed before the beginning of the 20th century. The fort was reopened in the early 1900s and used during both World Wars. Besides one event during World War II, the fort did not experience any action. While it was helpful to have a fort on the mouth of such a major river, the entirety of the fort can truly be summarized as a fort of very little importance. Fort Stevens is still very much intact today, despite being a little run down. The batteries and official buildings were made to last, so despite being gutted of all weapons, they still look very much like they did when the fort was open.
So here we are at Fort Stevens at one of the batteries, Battery Russell, that was built in the early 1900s and used during World War II.
Battery Russell is separated from the rest of the fort because it was built to protect the Pacific Ocean rather than the Columbia River. The battery today looks more like a scene from a horror movie. The inside of the structure is pitch black in some parts. The inside of the battery is much larger than appears to be on the outside. Battery Russell is also important because it is near to the spot where the Japanese submarines shot shells at the fort. The fort was never actually hit. Only the beach and baseball diamond received damage. Today, there's a plaque right next to Battery Russell commemorating the event and calling for world peace. At the Visitor Center, there is a museum containing exhibits on every war the fort was around for. The museum starts with the Civil War, even though the fort did not open until after the war ended. The best part of the exhibits is there is actual equipment displayed that was used at the fort. There are also guns and vehicles from the fort placed right outside the building. The best thing in the museum is the scale model of the fort during its prime. The model shows exactly what the fort would have looked like during the World Wars. It shows where the soldiers would have lived, something the fort does not show today since the barracks are long gone. Most impressive, the model shows just how large and extensive the fort truly was. If you would like to see how large the fort is firsthand instead of looking at a model, you can always take a tour of the fort in a classic military vehicle. One more cool aspect at the fort is something that actually has nothing to do with the fort at all. On the beach alongside the fort, there is an old rusted hull left from a shipwreck. The ship, the Pierre Iredell, wrecked on shore in 1906. The crew unloaded all supplies, but the ship could not be moved. The skeleton of the ship remains to this day and is a popular tourist destination. Visitors can climb inside the hull or look in the tide pools that have formed in what remains of the masts. The Pierre Iredell may not have anything to do with the fort, but it is definitely something to check out when visiting Fort Stevens.